I'm Corie Weathers. You're listening to Military Culture Shift, a limited series podcast on the impact of war, money, and generational perspective on morale, retention, and leadership.
Welcome to the final episode of Military Culture Shift podcast with Corie Weathers. I am clearly not Corie Weathers. I'm Matthew Weathers. I'm her husband. I've been watching her walk this road for years. As a licensed clinician, struggling, getting her jobs up and running in the various different places we lived. The current place we live is now our seventh move in 9 years. I've watched her live with this population. I've watched her walk alongside them. I've watched her be passionate about the multitude of varied things that, as she has found out, that this culture has always struggled with, and especially has even been on the radar of leaders within the last 40 years, consistently struggling with these things. And yet always from the perspective of wanting to make a difference in the world, wanting to make it better, wanting to make a change. We have multiple quotes around the house, and one of them is Mother Teresa says, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. But there's another one that's very near and dear to us, which is be the change that you want to see in the world. So in fall of 2022, when I half-heartedly made some sort of a maybe joking statement.
That's how it all starts.
About how much you had been talking about all these things and pulling all these things together over the course of the years, how you had spoken truth and comfort and normalcy and validated the experiences of all the people that you've been having either counseling, coaching, or just side conversations with, and telling them you're not alone, telling these people you're not alone, you're struggling with the same thing that dozens, if not hundreds of other people are struggling with. And I made a half-hearted comment while we were day tripping up in Waco, Texas. I made the comment, and it sounds like you should write a book. And I didn't really know that you were going to take it seriously, probably at the time. But you just had this flurry of thought, all these things. So this has been a year and a half. This is probably we're coming up on probably 2 years of you seriously thinking about this. I remember the first few weeks, maybe a couple of months, as you were trying to bring these thoughts together. We laminated index cards and put magnets on the back of them, and the whiteboard that's behind you that has slowly gotten erased over the last 18 months was just this Jackson Pollock trying to figure out, like, where do these things fit in? How do they all fit in? Where do it's like you built the Lego Death Star without any instructions. You just had all the right pieces, right? So I want to ask you, what was your experience in those initial few months? What was it like to try and struggle with bringing this story to these pages, for putting, not pen to paper, but keyboard to computer, whatever, and to try and pull all these little strands, because you have connectedness in StrengthsFinder. How did your connectedness help you? What was the experience of, as you're initially deciding what tapestry this has to look like?
First of all, thank you for the kind words on all of that and all the effort towards serving people. I think that was something that we came into this lifestyle wanting to do together. And we may have initially thought that we were supposed to do that together, side by side. And there's been times where we have, and other times we've had to independently live out that calling. And so it's been an honor and will continue to be. But to answer your question, I do have connectedness, and that's one of the strengths in the Strength Finder that I've always struggled to see in my mind and see clearly. It's one I think other people struggle with too. And this book was really seeing some of my strengths come together all at the same time in a way that was really cool for me to experience, and really see, oh, this is what my brain does. And so I knew that there were certain topics that I needed to cover. There were topics that everybody asks about, thinks about, or maybe doesn't know to think about, such as the money, follow the money. And so on one hand, some of these index cards that you so kindly laminated and put magnets on, because I just kept erasing things and I just needed something to be able to move around on the whiteboard. There were things that I knew needed to be there, like follow the money and certain stories that were part of this puzzle. But as I would kind of think out, like, let's say one chapter or one strategy of how do you unpack such a wicked problem in a way that people will want to read it, knowing you and I both knew this was going to be a huge undertaking, not just writing it, but figuring out the strategy of how to write about it in a way that anybody might even hopefully want to read about it. So I think it was thinking out the strategy of the chapters. I think it was then kind of thinking through the details of what I thought would be in that chapter. And that would talk me out of that sometimes. But the point is that you have these stories that kind of back up or ground the topic. And then that, ignites something else in your brain that's like, oh, I can't talk about that if I don't talk about this first, And so it was a Jackson Pollock thing of just trying, and you've always been somebody who not only champions my career, but champions my strengths. And we joke all the time that you give these little nudges of, and I distinctly remember which restaurant we were in, what table we were at when you were like, I think it's time for you to write this book, and we had talked about it several times.
What restaurant were we in? It's
that little breakfast place that was in Waco. We've only been there once, but it was like a little bistro table. And it was probably the 10th time that we were talking and fleshing out like some of these topics that had been rolling around in my brain and in our conversations for years. And I think, my work had slowed down a little bit because I was anticipating a potential other government contract job. And when we realized that I had the space, that was when you said, I think it's time for you to write this book. And I think it was the permission from you to consider jumping into a project like that. But equally in similar ways, when I'm mapping this out and having this Jackson Pollock moment, there was times when you came up and you would say things like, you'd see the whiteboard and I would walk you through it and you would have these little nuggets of, oh, you can't talk about this if you don't talk about that, or think about it from this framework, or, that brings up another conversation that you had. And that brings up a whole other way to think about that topic or an additional piece to that topic, especially, that's, I can see that very clearly in the service member chapters at the end, where, yes, I had spoken with a lot of service members about and watched them in their process and seen couples as they navigated this career. But that was also because of your experiences and others that who are kind of echoing some of these same issues. So what was it like? It was like a Jackson Pollock madman from beginning to end, I think. But I felt so compelled because I needed this story. I needed this information to understand what was going on with the people that I was serving. I needed to flesh it out. And I knew that there were pieces that everybody had, but there was a whole lot of pieces that none of us had. And there was so much information out there that nobody had curated it and put it into a story where someone like me or another spouse or a military teen or even a service member getting to hear some of these pieces that they haven't experienced. It was not all in one place.
Yeah.
And so that was the compulsion to try to birth something into the world that didn't exist yet, as far as I knew.
So thank you for being accommodating, because when I would come up and offer any of those, hey, here's another thing to think about and another thing to think about. I think at some point you got frustrated because I just felt like I would just walk upstairs and drop these huge nuggets like, oh, well, you got to look at the national security strategy. Or maybe you came up with, I need to look at the national security strategy. But you got to this point where you were just like, it was stuff that you have experienced, stuff that you have read, stuff that you were learning about as you were reading. And I remember distinctly, you would read something and then you'd be like, oh, junk. Now I've got to go read the thing that informed what I just read.
Yeah.
Like I just read, like let's say, for instance, if you were reading an article about the difficulty within the national security strategy, and then you're like, well, I guess I just need to read the national security strategy. Yeah. And I guess I need to understand what the National Security Council does or what the National Defense Strategy actually does. I need to understand what that does. And I've watched you do this. Primarily, you work within the special operations community. And I've watched you, go from like not knowing how connected all of it is to having a better grasp on special operations and the nuances within it than most conventional soldiers and families do. So kudos to you. And I'm proud of you for not just going, well, this is my experience, I'm just going to write it, but for actually going in and going, no, I need to figure out what are these origin documents that I need to study, understand, because that will have implications for how it plays out later to see this grand big picture. So you used a couple of words that I wanted to focus on. One is curating, and we'll get to that. But you did say I was compelled, right? And I know what it feels like to feel compelled. Most people do. What was your feeling of compulsion? What did you feel compelled to do? Not just to write a book. What's behind it?
Every day I would sit down to write or read or research, and I would first of all think about and sit in on the feeling that didn't go away especially until the book was done. But even still today, I think it fuels me, but especially writing the book, it was the compulsion to serve the people that were feeling all of these things and did not have a voice. And that every news story that was coming out was not soothing, what we would call cynicism, what other people would call cynicism, and maybe it is tainted with a little bit of cynicism. I think it's also hurt. And I think it's also exhaustion and so many of the other words that I've used to describe it. But I felt compelled to tell their story. I felt compelled to have people taken care of. I think my biggest concern that drove me, the biggest fear that I had, and that has only been validated, and I feel it even more now, is that I'm afraid that it's true. I'm afraid it's also going to happen, which is that our cohort, which is the Afghanistan, Iraq, GWAT veterans and their families, that this cohort will just go quietly into the night without being tended to, without being thanked, without being served, without being healed, without being restored back to the nation. And my biggest fear that drove me to write about it was that in some ways we were just like, this is just the way that it goes, that this is what every veteran goes through, that it's the natural progression of serving your country is to get this place where you've been used up, chewed up, spit out, and you just go take your seat at the VFW and you tell your war stories there and feel disconnected and feel this deep longing for that connection again, or to feel seen, or to feel like it was valuable, or to make sense of it, or whatever, but to feel like nobody can understand it except for those who were there. And there's always going to be truth to that. But I did not want our cohort to take their seat in that seat that they have earned, retirement, rest, whatever you want to call it, and not feel like their story was told, and told in a timely way where there's still time to serve them and to give them a chance to, my new word, thanks to Stony, is to reconstitute and to heal and to reintegrate and to maybe, just maybe, find the spark again that made them want to serve in the first place, and that they can maybe cross the finish line just a little bit more invested in and a little bit more different than what the Vietnam veterans experienced, I guess. And so I still have concerns about that, but I felt like perhaps I could write something that was my love letter to the community, that honors them, that honors what we have experienced, what we've seen other people experience, and that people would feel honored and feel seen, and then would then go lead in that same way to see other people. And then maybe we could just maybe close the gap a little bit.
But this isn't something that you've just experienced as a counselor, whether through the screen with virtual counseling or sitting in a counseling room. You started as a Care and a Go team leader within the first few months of our deployment in 2008. Volunteer position, and you were chosen for that or volunteered for it because of your skill set as a licensed counselor. And then when we moved from Carson, went to Stewart, and you hung a shingle with, I don't even remember the name of the counseling practice. And even there you were going, there's not enough. Like, there's not enough care for this community. And I remember you went on post to the behavioral health clinic on post, and you asked, how can we work together? How can we partner to close this gap? And you were told in no uncertain terms, we don't work together. We're not partners. You're competition. Mm-hmm. And it shocked you. And I remember you coming home being like, can you believe this? That this is an issue of scarcity, and we're seen as competition. And you've had a fire lit under you for that entire time. Mm-hmm. But it's
specifically, they told me that I, as a spouse clinician, was taking business from them, even though they had a 6 to 8 month waiting list of suicidal soldiers.
Yeah. Right. We don't want to lose that business, right? I mean, we gotta, the backlog, right? Got to keep supply and demand to justify my job. But anyhow, but you've also lived that as a spouse and as a close friend. So you're not just seeing this happen in a professional capacity. You're experiencing this in a personal capacity. And yet, even when you're in a professional capacity, I don't believe you're somebody that just keeps a non-empathic distance from people. So what is the internal, like, that's your sense for this cohort. What is it that you've been experiencing as a military spouse? And free reign, go ahead. Mm-hmm. And that has also made you so passionate about telling the story?
Well, I mean, I would like to say that my story is similar to other people's stories, that it's not necessarily unique in that, I mean, yes, professionally, I have served a lot of people, but I think, when you have been through deployments yourself and you've experienced the end of yourself, and navigating, which I'm like other spouses that I write about in the spouse chapters of, and I tried to be open with that, the beliefs that govern and encourage and also pressure a lot of us to continue to find the grit needed to do each day. But I think it was also being a first responder, if you will, to Gold Stars. It was sitting there in the first few moments of, capturing someone's heart that's falling to the floor as soon as the casualty team leaves, and you walk right in and you're catching their heart, because you're the first person that, maybe not the first person they're going to show emotion to, but a different kind of reaction. And so experiencing that many times, it becomes such a sacred thing to sit in those moments. And civilians have that too. I mean, loss is loss, it's shock is shock, and so, but for me as a spouse to go through those moments I'll never forget when you had soldiers that were, I think it was the battle with Tyler where we lost Tyler, but I, as an extension of you back home, went to go see the soldiers in the hospital, and was there as shortly after they got there and arrived, to just visit them. And so soldiers who had been injured from battle, and you're, one of the first citizens that they see, these are all just sacred experiences, that it's not just about being a counselor and serving people. And that's one of the most sacred things that I could do. But when your life and your work is filled with all of these moments of some of the highest highs of joy and community and the lowest lows of what humanity can go through, and, all in service to your country, it shapes your life. It shapes your life in a way that I love these people. I am these people. Like we as a couple, fit in this tribe well. We struggle with some of the same things that other couples have struggled through, navigating your career, navigating my career, navigating our kids' wellness, navigating, all of the challenges, and walking alongside the same experience and roller coaster ride as so many of the other GWAT families. And so, I worked very hard to not write in my own story and make sure that anything that I added that was of mine also was something that other people are also going through. But I don't think I'll ever be a person that's like, what I needed out of all of this was for me to be served, for us to be served, for us to get something out of it. I think it was more, it can be so discouraging to know. And I think so many people I've talked to, especially since the book went out, would ask me the question, are you trying to change the institution? And them asking me that, hoping that I'm trying to change the institution, and us all knowing that changing the institution will take a very, very long time. Yeah. So the reality is that I hit that wall just like everybody else. That's discouraging, going, well, what do we do if we can't change the institution? Then going back to your question on compulsion, it all comes down to, can I change me? Can you change you? Can you be a leader then that makes a difference? Because as was evidenced in the book and in the podcast episodes, there have been key leaders that absolutely shaped our world. And so I have to believe that there are other leaders out there. I know that there are other leaders that will continue to shape other people's worlds.
In answering that question, you brought up a lot of examples, and it leads me to the second word that came out, curating. And so there's these words that are like seasonal words. And so for a long season, your word has been curating. And whether it was, let's acknowledge that there is just a massive amount of information and data that's out there. And really it's like, being a professional librarian of all that data and curating it. When did you become aware that you were curating stories, curating experiences, curating people's affect, curating all these things that led to this, oh my gosh, I'm seeing this pattern? So actually that was my learner as a strength. Again, going back to Strength Finder, I knew that I was a learner. That's where all the data and the reading and the curiosity comes from, is I, in order to understand that and speak about it and teach on it or write about it, I have to learn about it. And so I can go down these rabbit holes, and that can be very exciting. And it also can get in the way. Like you and I, we joke that we can't even watch a show downstairs without me having to Google something about something in the show. Just for the listener at home, I have become quite all right with her having her phone, because she is literally like, we're watching Franklin and she's like, why are they wearing white makeup? And I go, I don't know, look it up.
I have to.
And we have just... I'm just,
I have to, it actually helps me understand what's happening.
Yeah. 5 minutes later, we get an answer while the show keeps going. She's like, what just happened? I'm like, it's too late. You missed that part.
Well, and that's where all the data and all the research comes from. But you asked me earlier about my connectedness, and that's where I really saw the connectedness really come to life for the first time, seeing it connect all these data points together and really it wasn't just about going down a rabbit trail. It was connecting to, for example, so many people have reached out to me and they catch the seed that I planted in the book about how in the 80s, so many of the spouses were addressing some of the same issues that we're addressing today. And that was such a light bulb, frustrating thing for me to find going down that rabbit hole of research to go, oh my, I remember it was one of those things that I ran down the stairs to talk to you about going, you're not going to believe this. This is the same exact stuff that we've been talking about for 40 years.
Right.
And it was,
and I have since forwarded that white paper to so many people only to look at the look of disheartenedness on their face. They're like, are you serious? And I'm like, yes.
And that's the perfect example of a learner wanting to know, whatever sparked originally that white paper and finding it, to the connectedness of going, oh, this is what they did then, but this is what we're doing now. And then you start asking, well, why have we not made that progress? And then comes up with all these other questions that you have to go down each of those rabbit holes to figure out why is that not happening? So the connectedness ties it all together like a spider web in my head. But going back to the word curated, I know that people are not going to pick up a book if there's not good strategy behind the storyline, behind the strategy of how you organize the book. Mm-hmm. And you also have to, as much as I am not a salesperson, you have to, if you're going to work really hard on a project, you're going to have to also sell it, talk about it, train with it, whatever. And so I love Masterclass, going back to my learner again, the subscription for Masterclass. And so every now and then, my learner will watch, whether it's Yo-Yo Ma or whether it's the Kardashians talking about business or President Bush talking about his speeches, which is where some of the bullhorn address insight, that I talk about in the book came from his masterclass. And so I might be watching random things on Masterclass, and you never know when a little nugget pops out, and it ties, that connectedness ties all these things together in a way that you wouldn't have been able to tie them together if you didn't kind of meditate on it and chew on it a little bit. And so Daniel Pink in his Power of Persuasion Masterclass was the one that said, everybody, and this goes to the Gen Z data that we talk about now, that knowledge is everywhere. Everyone has access to knowledge, that you can Google anything. And so he was the one that said, experts are no longer experts for how much they know. You become an expert by whether or not you can curate the information, whether you can make sense of the information that people pull together.
Right.
And so when he said that, I knew if I was going to teach that, if I'm going to tell people, you have to not be a leader to Gen Z that just spouts a bunch of information. I clearly am spouting a ton of information in the book. But if I'm going to tell a leader to help a Gen Z make sense of the information that they're looking up, make sense of the information that you're giving them, that you bring wisdom with it, that you are going to be this curator as an expert, as a leader, then I knew I needed to model that in the writing of the book. I needed to take some of the information that everybody has, some of the information that maybe you don't have, piece that all together and curate it in a way that helps you make sense of it.
Right.
So that you can go and tell that story or pieces of that story in an educated way. So it wasn't so much that I'm claiming to know everything, because I am still learning, but I really wanted to curate it. If that's what the world is needing right now, is to make sense of what's already out there, then I wanted to model that with a book.
Right. So you did, clearly. And I say that not just because I've read the book and I like it, right?
You've not read it as many times as I have.
No one has read it as many times as you have.
Lord help me.
Now you're on the other side. You have wrapped up the podcast. Or this is, by the time people are hearing this, podcast is over. Book is done. You are still traveling and speaking. You are still traveling and teaching. We just came back from you teaching at the National Defense University, where you were followed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and you were invited there as not just a guest speaker, but a credible source that helps to paint this picture of the problem that we're up against. And defining a problem is the first thing in the Army problem-solving method, the Army design methodology. You've got to accurately, clearly define the problem. And yet this is the spaghetti diagram from Afghanistan all over again. What has been your experience traveling around, talking, seeing how it's impacted and affected people's lives personally and professionally? What are some of the aha moments that you've gotten to receive as other people were able to step inside that brain that you put out onto all those pages? And how did that impact you? How did that like come full circle for this place of like, I started out because I wanted to give voice. I gave voice and people felt seen and heard. What was your experience?
Oh, it's been beyond rewarding. You know, it's hard to describe if you've not been through it before, the risk and the vulnerability of working on any book, any project, and putting it out there and hoping people like it, especially when it's going to take an immense amount of effort and it's going to be expensive. You know, you talk about like giving me over, you know, it was an incredible investment. There's been several conversations along the way, not, you know, where it was just like, are we okay with me investing this much time, you know, time and energy into something, and we don't even know what's going to happen with it, but you have this gut level feeling that you're telling the truth. And so from the beginning, you know, there's been so many beautiful moments that have just been rewarding. Like I had some of my own goals, you know, other than just getting it published and out, that I definitely exceeded some of those goals. I mean, the National Defense University wasn't even on my list, but you know, although I will say, like, I wrote it with the mindset of wanting these schoolhouses that were launching future leaders to consider it a culture analysis,
right?
Like a textbook. And so to be able to be invited to some of these military institutions,
to War College,
yes,
to Quantico,
yes,
to the National Defense University,
yes,
to the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center.
Yes. I mean, you say all of that and I'm like shocked that, you know, in my brain at the time was, this would be amazing for them to see it as a credible resource.
Right.
And then to have this opportunity to go and actually not only teach, you know, some trainings at these schoolhouses, but talk with faculty, be interviewed by some of the podcasts for those, you know, those institutions, and to see other people's intellectual brains light up when you're engaging in this conversation, that we're all expanding our mind just a little bit beyond the singular issues that and problems we thought were going on, but to see the spaghetti diagram just a little bit more clearly, to see the complexity of what we're facing just a little bit more, and for it to always land on the simplicity of just be a good human and lead well, love well, like. Right. That yes, it's incredibly complicated, and do your part on the things that are in your lane. But if it's not in your lane, just be a good human and leader, and be intentional and thoughtful. Be a nice human, right? Mm-hmm. So the institutions, that has been amazing. To also be able to talk with the spouses, you know, at the institutions that are wanting professional development. From the beginning, to have couples, like some of my favorite stories are spouses who. There's so many spouses that from the beginning just trusted that this was a good book because they trusted me, and really put the book out there for them to order a book and to get it in the mail and to start reading it. And their spouse, the husband, to come home and go, "Oh, you ordered that book that I've been seeing on LinkedIn for me." You know, and the spouses go, "No, this is for me. You get your own book," you know, and then to have them send me couple pictures of them each reading their own version. But more importantly, them having conversation about it, to feel like I'm educating spouses on things that were not normally dinner table conversation for them, and to educate the service member on stuff from the spouse world or things that they don't maybe say out loud, but for them to have these conversations as a couple is just the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah.
Other amazing stories. I mean, I've had people come up to me in tears that have just, you know, even this last week, somebody came up to me in tears, just barely able to talk to me, but really it was coming from a place of, that's my story.
Yeah.
You wrote my story. And I didn't know that anybody else saw that or felt that. And you gave voice and words to things that I didn't have words for. Like those kinds of things are magical.
So you've been counseling military families. You've been counseling families, couples for decades. You bring up this thing of like people coming up and going, you gave words to my feeling. You see me. You told my story. I feel seen and heard. Those are all things that a great clinician does when somebody shows up and knocks on their door and says, hey, I need somebody to talk to. When you say that, I wrote this book, this wasn't just an exercise in understanding the bureaucracy. This wasn't just an exercise. And I know I keep saying that it wasn't just like, let me unpack the nuts and bolts. There was a really raw and continues to be visceral experience that cannot be divorced from the bureaucracy. So you both have to understand the bureaucracy, but you have to understand bureaucracy is still like has, skin and names and experiences.
Well, I think what's different maybe is that I see the bureaucracy. I see the administrative, the politics, the whatever, but working with people behind confidential doors, when you get to hear people's stories of their marriage struggling because of it, when you get to hear people's stress, service members saying, how cynical they're feeling towards the end, or how I'm battling depression, battling destructive behaviors, that it's not so much about just somebody's a terrible person who's going to be a toxic leader, but underneath the surface, it is sometimes grief. It is depression. It is these big questions of what was all of this for? It was, all these things underneath, and you get to hear some of that behind confidential doors. Or you're working with a couple and it's starting to affect their marriage. Or let's just say we're getting close to retirement, and somebody, one person is very, very ready to just put that packet in. And the other one just is like, maybe just one more. And we all know it's a mixture of both this thing that you love to do, but also the addiction to fill in the blank, whatever that addiction is or that temptation is. And when those kinds of dynamics in a relationship are turning destructive, when you are able to be in the trusted place of hearing these stories behind confidential doors, and then you hear enough of them after a while, you almost have to test the waters on it and go, hey, wait a minute, let's have one big giant family meeting here, because here's what I think is actually going on here. Yeah. Like, are we actually all okay with this fill in the blank, Yeah. And let's talk about it. And so when you have enough people that are like, oh, me too. Oh, me too. Yeah. And then I can, even talking with someone, at an event or whatever, you start to see some of these traces of similar issues, some similar feelings, and you realize how widespread it actually is. It's like there is and can be different kinds of sickness that is influencing us all. And at some point we have to stop and pause and talk about it, and talk about what can we do about it and what can we not do about it. Right. And then how do we get our families across the finish line healthier? Yeah. So like create the space for people to be able to tell their story and to be honest with where they're at. And I can attest that I've taken the various things that you've brought up, the various trends that you brought up, and you and I sit there and talk trends all the time. And so one of my greatest joys was coming home and being like, hey, this thing that you're onto, I heard it in 3 different places today. Yeah. I heard it in 5 different places this week. I am testing out these things, and I'm going to service members going, hey, do you feel or think this, or is this your experience? How do you think your spouse feels? And then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, that's the truth. And it's like, yes, you're on, not only are you on to something, this is widespread. Yeah. And I think it wasn't so much only about, are we on to something? Yeah. But is this a need that people are, when in their reactions, that you and I have seen these moments of like, oh my goodness, like, yes, this is going on in my life or in my relationship. And is there a way to address that? Like, so when you start seeing the need that people have, I think goes back to the compulsion. When you are surrounded with so much need and you see people are needing wholeness. They're needing healing. They're needing rest. They're needing, and that was the biggest thing. I think that was there was lots of things that motivated me, but in addition to wanting to see a whole cohort heal, I think there's always compulsion is this mixture of desire and passion, but sometimes anger. And when, just like a lot of other people listening to this, when we went through the Afghanistan exit, that was one significant thing to experience. But when we came right out of that and put our focus and attention right on China and Russia with no conversation, no moment to stop or rest or even talk about what rest could even look like. And that was never even a topic brought up at any point from the top down of like, okay, now that this is over, what will we do to take care of ourselves before we shift our attention? That was, to my knowledge, not put out anywhere. That was that anger in me that was like, wait a minute, I've been tracking this cohort.
Sounds like you got a 15-month extension on the day that somebody was supposed to come home.
Yes. We are in desperate need of repair.
Yeah.
And that was the anger. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of the conversation at the breakfast table where you said it's time to write a book, when I was just devastated, but also angry, but also what is this going to do to an entire cohort? How do you push families more, farther? And what are the consequences of that?
Right. That's
where I think the anger came from.
Yeah. That's true strategic thinking, which is like, where is this going to go? What is actually going to happen? What is the impact of that? Yeah. All right. The question is going to be, where do we go from here? Where do you go from here? And not just into summer and take a break, right? Not just like, but you've gotten to this point. You still have a lot of energy. I can see it. You still have a lot of hope, a lot of desire to continue to make an impact. You never rest. And that's a good thing, I guess. You've always got a to-do list and something is always popping hot. So what do you want to happen next? Where do you hope this goes? Or have you even thought that far?
I do think about it because I have to, or I would not make good decisions and I would not rest, you know? So I actually do want to address that first because it's very important to me to do the best that I can to practice what I preach and to model the things that I feel very strongly about seems right for most people. And so if the whole book and all of this is about reconstituting and giving respite to an entire cohort, then if I never model that, then there's something wrong there, you know? And so it is really important to me to take a break. I don't know exactly what that looks like because there are speaking engagements. And I think, you know, what you and I have talked about is just kind of addressing those engagements, but you know, it'll be nice for the summer to not necessarily have all the creative energy going towards a project. So, you know, I'm going to take a break from writing and podcasting and, you know, all of that. And I may come back to the Life Giver podcast and we'll see. But
now we have 2 microphones, so we could just sit up here and talk.
I know we've talked about that. We've talked about launching something, the 2 of us. So let us know if you want that.
We can make it if we try.
Just the 2 of us.
You and I.
So, you know, I am a creative. I'm a creative at heart. I really enjoyed making this podcast. I really enjoyed stretching myself creatively. It wasn't easy by myself, especially, but the writing, the music, the scripting in a different way was really, really wonderful and also challenging.
And I appreciate this form of long form journalism.
And you know, I love the creative side of that. So I wouldn't be surprised if I do eventually come back and do something with that creative energy. But first and foremost, I am going to rest because we need to model that. And just enjoy some time of just the speaking engagements and the clients that I currently have coaching and counseling. But some of the other things that have come up in not only writing, but teaching, the training is everybody seems to be like, agree, like, what's going on in the book and the overall consensus of what's going on in our culture right now. But the biggest questions that I get are, so what? Like, what do we do about that? And so I've been teaching for the last 2 years that people need to pilot. It's a great time to pilot new things, to be creative, to really bring in some of the younger generation to help test some of those pilots and those strategies. Everything from family readiness programs, not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but evolving it in some ways that keeps some of the tradition that's important to people, but also reaches the youngest generation. And so we're looking at maybe piloting a couple of team consulting kind of things to come in and see if we can actually test out some of those pilot strategies for taking care of families. Families are really struggling right now, and people aren't necessarily showing up for things, and that is okay. And that's part of what I've been teaching, dabbling a little bit in some of the practical pilots moving forward. I really want to be able to not have the answer, but if people are struggling to find an answer and if I've given words to the problem, what does it look like to actually pilot with some of the information that I am teaching on? Definitely not another book. The audiobook is coming out. So hopefully soon after this episode comes out, within a month or so, I hope the audiobook will be out, which will be wonderful for those of you who somehow have just sat here waiting for the audiobook, which I appreciate. But this is also our last year with our second son. And I made a huge commitment with our first son, when he was playing football, that I would be home every Friday, no matter what, for those games. And I think I only missed one game. And so I want to be able to have that level of intentionality too in the next year. So several things as possibilities, but nothing that is as all encompassing as what I put you through in the last year and a half, which you were just such an amazing support.
I am amazing. That's just all we should just do an episode on that. So
you're the one that, by the way, offered to interview me for this finale.
You're welcome. Here it is. Ready? Here's how we're going to close it out. This is the coda. This is the finale. What thoughts over the course of the last 18 months, either writing, podcasting, or speaking, have stood out to you? And only pick 3 or 5. So what are the thoughts? What is...
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Thoughts that have stood out to me and have stayed on my mind. Number one, the realization and conclusion of the likelihood that we are a military welfare state has stuck with me. In that, and I won't expand on all of these, but in that even the civilian sector views us differently than I originally hoped or thought. To realize that it's one of the reasons why we feel this disconnect from the American culture is that some, not all, but some see us as a community that has made these choices and has pretty much brought this on ourselves. And that we find ourselves, understandably, with the dynamics and the way that this institution runs, in some cases, very stuck in it. It doesn't mean we actually are, but there is some tendency to see that. So that was a huge eye opener that stays with me a lot. Like we said earlier, another thought is how many of these issues we've been working on for far too long without much advancement. And when you come to that conclusion, I hope it fires us all up to be able to use our voices in a way that goes, no more. Like, something has to change. And that means we had to educate ourselves on how to do it. But if it can change, it needs to change. The importance of valuing the younger generation, not to bend around them completely. I'm a bridge builder. I am about how do we listen better to each other and use our strengths to be a better team. And so how do we use the strengths of the younger generation to help us with the technology, with the distribution of information, with these new pilot programs and creative solutions? If we don't, we are going to be in a much bigger problem than we are right now. And I'll pick one more. I think the biggest thing that it all comes down to, again, over and over and over again, and I'm sure, anybody listening to this podcast has heard it a million times, but the theme of the book and the theme in all of these conversations comes down to people and caring about people. And if we lose our heart, if any one of us loses our heart for people, then we will turn into a toxic leader and we will create more destruction than anything else. And so that theme has not only been in my heart this whole time, but it has been validated by almost every conversation and every interview. I think the lesson in all of this is, first of all, stretching yourself is worth it. You definitely need to talk to your spouse when you're taking on something that's going to be a huge project. And I've, for the most part, especially in the last 10 years for sure, I have never said yes to something without getting your blessing first. Now, we may have regretted that later, where you're like, I don't know if we understood what we were walking into, but it's always been worth it to stretch myself and try something that I've not done before and see if I can do it. And I feel now more than ever that those are opportunities to feel alive, to learn something new, to see what you're capable of, to keep yourself growing, to keep yourself challenged. And that has been so difficult, but yet so rewarding. And I don't think that I would have wanted to just stay doing the same thing I was doing 20 years ago. And maybe there's other people out there that are like that, and that's okay. But for me, just the courage to try something new is important. So,
well, you've been in the habit of reinventing yourself for decades. So
in a lot of ways I was forced to, and so,
but you embraced it.
I think I had to, or I think that I would have succumbed to my own level of cynicism and resentment and would have really struggled in this lifestyle. So thanks for inviting me on this incredible opportunity to constantly reinvent myself.
You're welcome.
But I think what I'll say, and then I'm going to let you wrap up.
All right.
Is that it has been such an honor and still will continue to be an honor to serve people and their stories and their heart and their willingness to sacrifice their own comforts and conveniences to live this life and to love the people around them. It has just been such a joy to meet people, talk to people, serve people, empower people, encourage leaders to be stronger, better, more authentic leaders. It's a joy. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do it. And so thank you to those of you who listened to this podcast, that took this ride with me, that especially if you read the book, it's okay for those of you who are moving slowly through it. I know a lot of you are. We knew this would be a slow burn as far as reading it and digesting it and learning to live differently in light of it. But I'm just so grateful. And I think my word for the last year and going into this year has just been grateful. I am just grateful for the people, for the opportunity to be done. And I just am taking each step as it comes. I'm grateful.
So that concludes the Military Culture Shift podcast with Corie Weathers. That's the official out. So I want to tell you this. I love being on this journey with you. Absolutely. Like, not only do I just adore you as a human, as my wife, as my best friend, is just somebody that laughs at all my jokes, even the ones that aren't funny, but you still giggle. I appreciate it. Thanks for the courtesy laughs. You amaze me at every turn. What you have done with yourself in this very Renaissance thing over the last 18 months. You have reinvented yourself professionally, and it's had a deep and abiding personal impact on our family in a good way. You and I have always wanted the boys to see what a strong, intelligent, mostly independent in the best ways woman looks like in the world. So they have a standard to look for. And this is also what to champion. This is what it means to champion and support your spouse through different seasons as those seasons ebb and flow. So I am beyond incredibly proud, just doesn't even sum it up. I'm blown away. And it is very true what I felt when I saw you teaching at NDU this past week of, if I was just a student sitting in the audience, I would find all of this incredibly thoughtful, some deep foresight, and I would be challenged to think in some new ways. And you just knocked it out of the park. And I've been watching you teach for 20 years, and you have grown and matured and evolved in the absolute best ways. So even though we hit speed bumps when we were like, maybe this is going to take a lot. This is really going to take a lot. And, it was all worth it. The whole journey, the whole trip is all worth it. And so I want to encourage you, if you're listening out there and you're married, champion your spouse. Tell them on a very regular basis how capable they are, how amazing they can be. Believe in them, because if you're not believing in them, they may not believe in themselves. But you'll be surprised at what can happen in a marriage and in a family when you believe in one another and you champion one another. Because, when it comes to it, at the end of the day, you're all you got. And at some point, service members, we're all going to go back to a first name. At some point, you're going to hang the uniform up one last time. And it's really good if you turn around from the military and to face a family that is ready to receive you with open arms, that knows exactly what you've been through. And spouses, likewise, don't hang your dreams up on a coat rack to pull them down in 20 years. Mm-hmm. Don't hang them up. Don't put them in a closet, because by the time you go back to that closet in 20 years, they're not going to be there.
Or it's not going to fit or be relevant for what's happening in the world. Life
may have moved on. So champion each other, encourage one another, get a big ass whiteboard and put it in an office. And whether that is going to be the script for the next book, or whether that's going to be your dreams of how you acquire and drive away in your RV, dream, cast vision, and champion one another.
The world's been trying to end for years, and the gangsters been cashing in on our fears. It's all over the TV, all over the news, everything the politicians do. But I made a choice and I ain't moving on. I'm gonna hug my baby, sing my girls a song. I'm gonna stop for a minute, give God some praise, slow the train. Yeah, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you. Thank you for this beautiful day.
The Military Culture Shift podcast is sponsored by New Res and written and produced by me, author, speaker, and military clinical consultant Corie Weathers. The closing credit song is Thank You, written and performed by veteran James Corbin. This is a supplemental leadership podcast for the book Military Culture Shift, The Impact of War, Money, and Generational Perspective on Morale, Retention, and Leadership. Copies of the book can be purchased on Amazon, militaryfamilybooks.com, and your other favorite retailers. More information, including graphs, data, and other resources mentioned in the book, can be found on my website, CorieWeathers.com.
Instead of trying to find ways to kill each other, let's bear a burden, let's love a brother. Cause life moves by awful fast. When you're gone, what of you will last? So take the power from the talking heads, forget every single word that they said, and stop for a minute, give God some praise, slow the train, everybody say thank you. Thank you for this beautiful day. Thank you. Thank you for this